It's my feel-good breakfast show.
Welcome back. This is your Feel Good Breakfast Show on a Thursday morning, and it's time for baby talk. Now, as most parents will tell you, one of the most difficult parts of rearing a child is the fact that they cry all the time. They cry when they're on their way out. They cry on their way in. They cry in the shop, in the cinema, in the plane, or the car. They cry. Do we understand why they cry? Not necessarily always, and that's why we have the expertise of Meg Faure here. She's an occupational therapist and parenting author as well, to help us just maybe ease our tears, because we have internal tears that cry inside.
Oh, dude, you've got such a journey ahead of you, especially in the early days, because there is a lot of crying. I've now realized it comforts me. If I don't hear a baby crying, I think something's wrong. But why do babies cry? Is it all they can do, maybe?
Yeah, I mean, it definitely is it's a form of communication. So they're telling us what's going on for them. And for us as parents, it gets us to respond very quickly, because there is nothing like that sound of your new baby crying. So
it rattles your inner ear.
Yeah. And it also teaches them that somebody connects with them and will respond to them. And that's very important for long-term relationships, that you know that when you do something, somebody else is going to respond, because that's what relationships are built on.
Yeah. What do you think is it about us as human beings that when you, no matter what the reason is and why they're crying, that you do go and then you feel like attending to them? Is it because we have a feeling that they're in some kind of imminent danger, or are we? What is it about us?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose, I mean, it is a switch, and it definitely gets our adrenaline pumping, because we immediately think we've got to quiet them. And I suppose that does go back to having, like, you know, when we were living in the wild, potentially, if your baby was making a noise, they could then be under threat because they draw attention to themselves.
Yes.
So we very quickly want to respond. And we also do project our own emotions onto it, because if I see you crying, I immediately want to respond to you as a human being to, you know, to kind of calm you. And so we do that as parents.
And you often think they're crying about something that you can rationalize without kind of thinking about it from their perspective. But surely if we think of it in an evolutionary kind of way, surely that would have alerted predators to their presence. That doesn't seem like the best survival trait.
No, it definitely doesn't. But it's a good survival trait, because then we respond very quickly.
Pick up our stone spear and we're there.
Exactly. The only thing is, I think that with babies, that they're not always crying because they're in distress. It's the only form of communication. And often as parents, you know, kind of as they hit that 6-week mark and they start to find a new form of communication, which is smiling, which comes about at 6 weeks, then suddenly things get a whole lot easier, because they're not just communicating through crying.
Yeah.
But in the early days, it's a lot of crying.
But you learn to read the cry.
Yeah, and in fact, in the very, very early days, when babies are born, the first thing they do is cry. What does that initial cry indicate, and why do they cry when they're born?
So it's quite interesting. I mean, babies cry within the first few minutes of birth, usually because they've just taken a breath. And so they have to take a breath, breathe in, change of temperature, and as they breathe in, we know that their blood actually changes direction in their bodies. So a huge amount happens in that first second of birth.
Shift.
It's a massive shift. So a huge amount happens in that moment of birth. As that blood changes direction to move through the lungs, so it can be oxygenated, the babies then start to cry. But what's very interesting, and what I didn't realize when mine were born, is that often babies actually don't cry after that. So they'll take that initial kind of wail, and then they're very calm after that. And they just lie very calmly.
I thought it was my face. I thought you saw my face. And no! Is there such a thing as a good cry and a bad cry?
Yeah, and that's the difficulty as parents, is that we're trying to work out which is the cry that says help and which is the cry.
It's like real trauma and what's not.
Yeah, so it's discerning those cries. What does help in the early days is to start to have a little bit of a gentle routine of knowing when feeds are due, because the main reason that your baby will cry in the early days is for feeds. And that is something that you start to get to know quite quickly. The dangerous cry, and I suppose as a new parent of a newborn, that's the one that you're wanting to know, what does that sound like? That can be the very desperate screaming that doesn't relent with feeds and, you know, before sleeps, and that can indicate infection. So early on, and that's pain. So you'd be wanting to check that your baby's umbilical cord is not red and raw and smelly, because if that is so, you've got a medical emergency and you want to get to the doctor quickly. And also if there's a massive change in the way that your baby's been. So if your baby has been somewhat fussy, but calmed with feeds, and now suddenly for a full day is screaming all day, and isn't soothed with feeds, and maybe isn't feeding very well either, that's another thing where you go, something's not going on well here, let's get them to the doctor. But for most other cries of newborns, they're actually, it's not dangerous.
Yeah, it's just the only way that they can really communicate with
Absolutely.
you.
And then we'll come back very shortly to chat further about how to deal with a crying baby. And what I want to know is that, is it possible, are babies emotionally intelligent enough to manipulate you by crying?
Don't you ever forget it, buddy.
They can do it. I've been told they can do it. We'll find out from Meg afterwards. Stay tuned.
It's my feel-good breakfast show.
Welcome back, you beautiful bouncing babies. It's Baby Matters with Meg Faure, and we are talking about, yeah, man, we love you. We love you, and we love new parents, parents-to-be, parents right now who are dealing with, maybe right now, you are sitting with a beautiful baby crying his little or her little heart out. We are talking about why babies cry this morning. And Meg, I'm loving this. I think you're loving this more than me. I've moved through the crying phase, thankfully, but you got a lot to come, bro.
I actually watched a series called The Letdown, which is quite funny, and profiles this Australian woman who has her first baby, and she and her husband are trying to sleep train the baby, right? And there's a school of thought that says, if a baby's crying, just leave them alone. Let them cry themselves out. They'll get tired of it. They'll figure out that you're not always going to rush to them when that happens. How effective is that as a method of teaching a baby to not
Surely
cry?
it's situational, yeah.
Well, look, I mean, efficacy and whether you should be doing it are two different things. Babies will stop crying if you leave them to cry because they'll get so desperate that you're not responding to them that they will stop crying. But it's a really, really not a good strategy to use with babies because they need to know that you are going to respond. That's part of relationships. So I'm definitely not a fan of cry it out for sleep training. That's what you would have been watching. I think you need to respond to babies. But having said that, you know, you need to know when to respond and when that and what their needs are.
What kind of cry it is, but dude, nothing will break your heart more than seeing your little man with that face, that lip quivering.
I've heard that. And like, in my mind, I'm going to be like, shut up. But I know that it's not going to be like that.
But dude, your reaction there is so pertinent because something that gives me chills when we talk about is it baby shaking syndrome.
Yeah.
That I was very judgmental of anyone who's ever, and it's horrific what can happen to a baby in that space. But when you're in the thick of it, you haven't slept for days, for weeks, the baby is crying so much so that it feels like they're hurting themselves, and you just want the crying to stop. And you don't know a solution. What is actually going on there? Talk us through that sleep cycle and how that applies.
And also, what is baby shaking syndrome? Because I, for instance, have never heard of baby shaking syndrome.
So shaken baby syndrome happens when parents are feeling absolutely desperate and they hold their babies and they just think, if I give them a little shake, they'll stop crying. And they give them a little shake. And what actually happens is in that moment, the brain, which is floating inside of the skull, moves slightly inside the skull, and there are little blood vessels along the edge of that, on the meninges, that can actually rupture.
Taking a knockout punch,
and it's just like a concussion, like a knockout punch, and it can actually kill babies. So there have been cases where babies have died. And what's interesting about it is that shaken baby syndrome is in parallel to how much a baby cries. So the more a baby cries, the more likely they are to be shaken. So we take it very seriously, which is one of the reasons that we want to kind of talk about crying for young babies.
Manage your own stress level.
We're going to go through the crying cycle as you were describing early on. We do have a caller on the line right now. Merlin, a very good morning to you. Thanks for the call. Go right ahead.
Good morning, guys. How are you doing?
Very
Good
well.
on you,
Thank
man.
you.
Good, great, guys. I think my method was actually turn the music up. I was actually a young dad. I was 24.
Sure.
And when my daughter was crying, I would turn the music just a bit up, not to drown her out, but kind of like a distraction.
Yes.
And that actually eased it. And then there's just a little dance and a waddle. I think she's 7 now, 7 years old now, and still if she gets into a bit of a tantrum mode, I tend to just do a little music just to distract her, but so that always helps. But I think the main thing is just staying calm and listening.
What kind of music, dude?
Funny enough, it was actually at that time in 2011. It was Bruno Mars. Was quite, it was quite the thing back then.
Yeah, man.
Just the way you are. Just the way you are, because you're amazing just the way you are. Merlin, thanks so much.
Oh, that's great.
Is that what you would advise
That
a
works
good
with us,
strategy?
man.
Yeah, no. So neurologically, there actually is a trigger, like an off switch that comes with a certain level of sound.
Yes.
It can be white noise. So even you'll see it on YouTube, kind of vacuuming in the room with the baby or playing white noise and the baby goes to sleep. Same with music. At a certain volume, babies actually just do switch down and calm.
Because they're used to that white noise from being in the womb, the blood pumping, that sort of thing. So we were talking about the correlation between the baby shaking or shaking baby syndrome and that sleep cycle. So taking it away from the extreme end of that scale, everyone is going to have to go through that sleep cycle. How does that actually work? What's that curve?
What's the curve? Yeah, so there's actually what we call the crying curve, and that is for most parents, and you'll experience it, Kat, in the first 10 days to 14 days, your baby will be very calm and actually won't cry a lot. And for many parents, they go, we've got this waxed. They're kind of such good babies. And then at 10 to 14 days, babies start to cry. 6 weeks old, the crying peaks, and by 12 weeks old, the crying dissipates. So it's that perfect curve, and it's universal. Those studies have been done with babies in New York City, the Kalahari, all babies do the same crying curve.
Yeah. Have they established why it is that after those 10 days now it starts rising up until the 6 weeks? It was 12 weeks, like you were saying.
Yeah. So there's a lot of theories. One of them is that the womb space is so tight and contained that babies have a lot of what we call proprioception, or kind of deep pressure, and that allows them to be a little bit calmer after birth.
Okay.
That's why you swaddle.
That's
That's
why
why it's
you
so
swaddle.
effective. And you tie your baby up in those first few weeks and it feels terrible.
Yeah.
But
No.
they love it.
They love it. Well, that's exactly it. Swaddling is one of the ways that we can actually manage crying. It's a wonderful way to do it.
When does our stress transfer to the baby? When can they feed off our energy in that way?
Yeah, look, I mean, I definitely do think that the more anxious we are, maybe the less we are able, you kind of emit this feeling towards our babies that we're not managing things very well. We might fuss with them slightly more, and babies just need to be really swaddled and kept calm. It's a very unhelpful thing to say to a parent, though, to say, you know, your baby's
If
picking
you're
up on
tired
your
and you're
stress
stressed.
levels, because then they go, well, I am stressed, how can I be less stressed? And it's not helping the situation. So it isn't helpful to say it, but I do think things like, you know, kind of Biral, which is a wonderful medication that has nothing, it's completely natural. Parents can take that, or a little bit of rescue remedy, just to feel a little bit calmer, because when you feel calmer, your baby will be calmer too.
And if you can, tag team, yo.
Yeah.
Definitely.
And you spoke about taking your baby out of the womb and bringing them out into the world. That in itself is a stressful situation, not just for the baby, but for you, because there are lots of eyes watching you.
Yeah.
A lot of judgment can be passed. I mean, you think
And
of...
you haven't slept
Exactly,
in a long
and you think
time.
of taking your baby onto a plane where if they are unsettled and you're unable to calm them down, they cry, everyone's like, what's wrong with this parent? It's a and then, you know, so what advice do you have for parents, let's say, that do travel and where that kind of experience could be had, and also
Even
for
in
the
restaurants, man,
and for those people that are judging, for them to understand that it's not necessarily the parents' fault, it's just what
I
babies do.
dare you if you see me to judge me and my baby.
So when you're traveling, a really good tip that I have is to get a really nice carrier, and it must be a tight carrier that contains them like in the womb, because then when you are getting onto the plane, when you're traveling through whatever area you're traveling through, you actually have got your baby on you and it calms them. So have some sort of strategy that you can use really effectively. And on the second note, don't judge other parents. You know, you don't know what it's like until you're in that moment of having a fussy baby, and it doesn't necessarily reflect parenting abilities. It can sometimes just be who the baby is.
Or just part of their daily life cycle. That's the time of the day that they're awake or they are crying, or, you know, but we love it, man. Hopefully parents who are feeling a bit more ready to deal with your crying baby, and if you do have a crying baby, just relax, guys. It'll all be okay.